Today, we're doing something a little different. Instead of a broad analysis, we're going to zoom way in on a powerful, firsthand story. We're going to share the testimony of a man named Medi, who lived under and then escaped from Iran's Islamic regime. And his story kicks off with this absolutely bone-chilling statement. It immediately tells you the stakes we're dealing with here. He survived things that many, many others did not, and he's here to tell us how. So you gotta ask, right? How did he end up in a situation where people were trying to kill him? Well, it all started when he decided to raise his voice against the regime during a huge wave of popular protest. To really get what he was doing, we have to rewind the clock to 2009, to something called the Green Movement. This was a massive protest movement that exploded after a really disputed presidential election. Regular people just poured into the streets demanding change. And this is a fascinating look at what activism looked like before social media was everything. Medi wasn't just firing off tweets. No, he was organizing protest groups by hand, writing the details on scraps of paper, and then secretly, house by house, delivering them. Talk about a risky thing to do. And that risk, well, it became very, very real one night. The regime forces didn't bother knocking. They jumped the wall of his home in the dead of night, blindfolded him, and just took him. In an instant, his whole life was turned completely upside down. And that violent capture, it marks the beginning of the next chapter of his story. And honestly, it's a really difficult one. This is his time inside an Iranian prison as a political enemy of the state. Based on what he saw with his own eyes, Medi describes a system of just calculated cruelty. It wasn't just about locking people up. It was about making people vanish. It was about staging murders to look like suicides or street brawls. Torture was just a routine part of the day. He saw other prisoners get taken for questioning and come back to the cell just covered in blood. And I want to be clear, this wasn't just something he saw happening to other people. He endured it himself. In his own words, he describes how they would use a sharp object, pressing and rubbing it into his skin, just to inflict pain, all while demanding that he give up the names of his fellow activists. But the regime's efforts to silence him went way beyond torture. They tried to murder him. Twice. The first time, they poisoned his juice, which sent him into a coma. The second time, he was attacked with a knife and stabbed 70 times. It is an absolute miracle he survived either of those attempts. After surviving all that, the conclusion was obvious. He had to get out, or he was going to die in that prison. So the story shifts again, from one of pure survival to a desperate, high-stakes plan for freedom. And this was no simple breakout. It was an incredibly risky, multi-stage plan that he cooked up with help from the outside. He had to fake a serious illness to get to the clinic, convince them he needed an emergency transfer to a real hospital, and then, while under the guard of 2 soldiers, make his move. But escaping the hospital, that was only step 1. To actually get to safety, Medi then walked for 12 straight days. Think about that. 12 days on foot through mountains and deserts, just to cross the border from Iran into Turkey. You would think after all that, he'd finally be safe. But his journey took another cruel turn. In Turkey, a smuggler took all his money and left him completely stranded. No passport, no ID, nothing. He had to hide during the daytime, terrified of being found and sent right back to the prison he just escaped. Now that he's finally safe, Medi's experience gives him this incredibly unique perspective on the true nature of the regime and what's really happening inside Iran today. So, from his view on the inside, here's how he breaks down support for the regime. He estimates that maybe 10% are the true hardcore believers. Another 10% are just kind of followers. But that leaves a massive 80% of the country who are opposed. The problem? That other 20%, they have all the power and all the weapons. And that reality creates this agonizing central question for the Iranian people, one that Medi asks himself. How can a population that is largely unarmed possibly take back its country from a heavily armed minority that stays in power by killing them? His answer to that might surprise a lot of people in the West. He says that many, if not most, people inside Iran actually welcome foreign help against the regime. He talks about people literally celebrating in the streets when military strikes from countries like the US or Israel took out key figures in the regime. And you know, this firsthand experience really shapes how he views some of the activism he sees in Western countries. He asks a really pointed question. Where were all these humanity protesters when the Iranian regime was slaughtering thousands of its own citizens. For him, anyone protesting in a way that helps the regime is what he calls a fraud, and he trusts the word of the victims over the opinions of outsiders. But when you get right down to it, beyond all the politics and the geopolitics, his fight is fueled by something deeply, deeply personal. It all comes down to a simple dream of one day being able to return home. And this is what it's all about. This is what keeps him going. The hope that he'll be able to turn to his wife one day and say, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to get ready to go back to Iran. I'm going to see my family. So why speak out now, knowing it's still so dangerous for him and his family? He says he used to be afraid, but not anymore. Now he feels like it's a duty for everyone who can to help expose the evil of the regime, or, in his own words, to show who they are. Medi's journey from protester to prisoner, from escapee to advocate, it leaves us with a really critical question to think about. When a single, powerful, personal story like this one cuts right through the noise of global headlines, what does it ask of us? What does it force us to see differently?